I never believed in ghosts. I thought every scary story had a logical explanation. But after what happened that night, I don't say that anymore. About a year ago, I was driving through a remote mountain highway after a business trip. It was late, raining hard, and there wasn't another car in sight. Without warning, my engine died. I tried restarting it over and over, but nothing happened. My phone showed one message that made my stomach sink. No signal. As I stood there wondering what to do, I noticed a faint light moving through the rain. An elderly man slowly appeared, carrying an old lantern. He smiled politely and asked if I needed help. Something about him felt unusual, but I was stranded, cold, and completely out of options. So I said yes. He introduced himself as Daniel and told me there was a cabin nearby where I could stay until sunrise. I followed him along a narrow trail disappearing into the forest. After several minutes of walking, we reached a small wooden cabin hidden among the trees. The fire inside was already burning, filling the room with warmth that instantly made me feel safe. Daniel handed me a dry towel and invited me to sit by the fireplace. He barely spoke at first, but his calm voice somehow made the storm outside seem very far away. A few minutes later, he poured us both fresh coffee. We talked about the mountains, the weather, and how peaceful life used to be out there. He smiled often, but there was a sadness behind his eyes I couldn't explain. The rain kept pounding against the windows while the fire quietly crackled beside us. For the first time that night, I thought maybe everything was going to be okay. Daniel seemed to know every trail, every river, and every hill in those mountains. It was like he had spent his entire life there. And maybe he had. He stared into the fire for a long moment before quietly saying, "Some places never really let you leave." I laughed awkwardly, thinking it was just an old saying. He didn't laugh back. A few moments later, Daniel suddenly turned toward the window. His smile disappeared. His eyes were locked on the darkness outside, as if he had heard something I couldn't. I looked through the glass, but all I saw was rain, fog, and endless pine trees. Still, the silence inside the cabin suddenly felt heavier than the storm outside. Then, knock. A single knock echoed from the front door, loud enough to make both of us freeze. Daniel immediately raised his hand. "Don't answer it," he whispered. "No matter what you hear, don't open the door." The knocking came again. This time, it was louder and faster. Within seconds, it became violent pounding that shook the entire cabin. My heart was racing. I carefully looked through the window, expecting to see someone outside, but there was no one. Only heavy rain and the empty forest. When I turned back, Daniel looked completely different. His hands were trembling. His face had turned pale. Whatever was outside, he was terrified of it. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The pounding, the wind, even the rain seemed quieter. We sat there in complete silence until the first light of dawn began to appear. As the morning light filled the cabin, Daniel stood up and looked at me with a serious expression. "You need to leave now," he said quietly. "Don't wait, just go." He walked me to the door and pointed toward a narrow trail through the trees. "Follow this path," he said. "It'll take you back to the highway much faster."
Thank you for everything.
I thanked him for saving me. He smiled one last time, but it wasn't the same warm smile from the night before. It felt like a goodbye.
Don't come back.
Just before I stepped onto the trail, Daniel spoke one final sentence. "Whatever happens, don't ever come back here." Then he slowly closed the cabin door. The trail led exactly where he said it would. Less than 30 minutes later, I reached the highway and found my car still sitting where I had left it. A tow truck arrived not long after. While the driver worked on my car, I casually mentioned the old cabin and the man named Daniel who had helped me. The driver stopped what he was doing and stared at me. "Daniel?" he asked. "Are you sure that's the name he gave you?" His voice suddenly sounded uneasy. I nodded and described the cabin in detail. The driver's face turned pale. "That cabin has been abandoned for years," he whispered. "Nobody lives there." I laughed and told him he had to be mistaken. I had spent the entire night inside that cabin. Eventually, he agreed to drive back with me to prove his point. When we reached the clearing, my heart nearly stopped. The cabin was still there, but it looked completely different. The windows were shattered, the roof had partially collapsed, and the entire place was covered in dust, moss, and vines. It looked like no one had lived there for years. I stood there in complete disbelief. This couldn't be the same cabin. Just hours earlier, the coffee had been hot, and Daniel had been sitting right across from me. Inside, everything was covered in dust. Broken furniture was scattered across the floor. Then, I noticed an old photograph hanging crooked on the wall. I picked it up and wiped away the dust. My hands immediately started shaking. The smiling man in the picture was Daniel. An elderly local happened to pass by and saw what I was holding. He quietly looked at the photo and sighed. "That's Daniel," he said. "He died 3 years ago while rescuing a traveler who got lost during a storm." My mind went completely blank. I tried to explain what had happened the night before, but the words wouldn't come out. None of it made sense. The local man offered to show me Daniel's grave. We drove to a small cemetery on a quiet hillside, surrounded by pine trees. There it was. Daniel's name carved into a weathered gravestone. The date confirmed everything. He had died exactly 3 years before the night we met. I placed a small bouquet of wildflowers on his grave. "Thank you," I whispered. "You saved my life." It was the only thing I could think to say. As I turned to leave, a gentle breeze moved through the cemetery. The trees swayed softly, and for just a moment, it felt like someone was standing beside me. I kept walking until I reached the old forest path. Then I heard a familiar voice behind me. "Take care. Your journey isn't over yet." I spun around immediately. There was no one there, only the wind moving through the pine trees and the quiet sound of birds in the distance. Somehow, I knew exactly whose voice it had been. I still don't know who or what I spent that night with. Maybe some mysteries aren't meant to be explained. But one thing is certain. I no longer laugh at stories about ghosts, because sometimes the people who save us are the ones who have already said goodbye to the world.